Welcome to Exploring the Mind, a partnership between the Ann Arbor District Library and the University of Michigan Department of Psychology. Today's talk is America's Fatal Failure: Why Have We Done So Poorly in Coping with COVID-19 with Dr. Shinobu Kitayama. For more Exploring the Mind videos, go to our website at aadl.org.
All right, thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Chris Monk. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Michigan. So today it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Shinobu Kitayama. So Shinobu is the Robert B. Zayantz Collegiate Professor of Psychology and Director of Culture and the Culture and Cognition Program here at the University of Michigan. He completed his undergraduate and master's work both at Kyoto University in Japan, and then received his PhD here at the University of Michigan. So he then became, after he received his PhD, he then became an assistant professor, followed by an associate professor at the University of Oregon. And after that, he returned to Japan, where he was an associate professor at Kyoto University. Then in 2003, we were very lucky to have him come back here to Ann Arbor to become a professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. So Dr. Kitayama's research focuses on cultural similarities and differences in a variety of mental processes such as self, emotion, and cognition. In particular, his research often involves comparing people from Asian countries such as Japan, the Philippines, and China with people in the United States. He's received many grants from the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, as well as many awards, including being awarded a Fulbright Scholarship, a Russell Sage Foundation Fellowship, and he is now the president of psychology's premier organization, the Association for Psychological Science. Shinobu's talk is entitled America's Fatal Failure: Why Have We Done So Poorly in Coping with COVID-19? Here is Dr. Shinobu Kitayama.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to speak to all of you. As Chris said, I'm Shinobu Kitayama. I'm a social and cultural psychologist at the University of Michigan. It's my great pleasure and privilege to be here, despite virtually, to share our own research work with all of you. My topic today is COVID-19. More than 1 year ago, COVID-19 hit us, initially in Wuhan, China, but quickly it spread all over the globe. Back then, I was spending my sabbatical year in New York City and witnessed some sufferings and misery in my own eyes. It didn't take me long to decide that we should study the pandemic and use this analysis to inform the central research agenda of my field of research, which is cultural social psychology. And of course, if this effort could enable us to make some contributions to the worldwide fight against COVID-19, that would be very, very wonderful. In discussing this problem, no one can really avoid these numbers. How can I hear? Well, especially in the United States. So far, as of today, January 22nd, 2021, 96 million people have been infected with COVID-19 worldwide. Out of this, approximately 25%, nearly 25 million, are Americans. Also, so far as of today, 2 million people have died of COVID worldwide. Again, about 20% of them, 0.4 million, are Americans. The US is a big country, but Americans' share in the world population is only 4%. 0.25%. So United States has failed. Why can that be? At the outset, I want to be clear, this man didn't help much. The absence of effective leadership is a major culprit. Some time ago, an editorial of the New England Journal of Medicine, the premier medical journal in the United States, said the following: COVID-19 really created a havoc in the United States. This crisis has produced a lot of test of leadership. When it comes to the response to the largest public health crisis of our time, our current political leaders, that is, back then, have demonstrated that they are dangerously incompetent. However, this political leadership was elected some years earlier, and it is also the case that substantial proportion of the population, possibly up to 30%, still supported this leadership up until this support began to erode after the riot on January the 6th. So the problem can be deeper and more systematic or systemic. And there may be cultural, socio-economic, and race-related root causes of the exceptional suffering of the United States and the people here. I propose that there are 4 critical factors in addition to the lack of effective political leadership so far. First, historically, the United States never instituted a universal mandatory BCG vaccination policy against, this is a tuberculosis vaccine, and that may be expected to produce positive effects in the fight against COVID-19. Now, second, there's a social structural factor. Social structurally, the United States is plagued with racism and enormous economic disparity. Third, culturally, Americans are very high in social openness, which is a trait I like, but which also may become a liability during a pandemic like the current one. And finally, psychologically, there's a reason to wonder if Americans are particularly prone to complacency and temptation to show that they are stronger than others by engaging in uncivil, sometimes even reckless behaviors. So let me start with this thing, BCG. BCG is a tuberculosis vaccination. It is quite effective at containing tuberculosis, a major killer in the 20th century. Importantly, however, as it turned out, several epidemiological studies have established that it is also effective in reducing the rate of death due to various respiratory infections. One experimental data shows that BCG initiates a series of genome-wide epigenetic changes, which in turn predict increased immunity against the experimentally administered virus. In the middle of the 20th century, last century, many developing countries mandated BCG. Interestingly, some countries, including the United States, never did so. Earlier this year, we compared countries that mandated BCG, countries that mandated at one point but discontinued it before the year 2000, and those countries that never mandated it. In making a cross-national comparison like this, one big potential problem is that countries vary massively in the availability of diagnostic tests and diagnostic criteria in determining whether a given case or death is COVID-related or not. These confounds can easily bias the total number of cases and deaths. However, they are unlikely to vary systematically within a fairly short period of time, say over a few weeks. Therefore, if we assess the rate of increase rather than the total number of cases or death, we can be sure that these confounds are very unlikely to contaminate our results. And for this reason, we looked at the speed of increase of infected cases and death in the very early period, in this case, initial 30 days of country-wide outbreaks. Here's what we got. The rate is significantly slower in the countries that mandated BCG all the time, compared to those countries that mandated it but discontinued before the year 2000, or that never did. And the United States is here. It never mandated it, and its growth rate is pretty high. Another factor I want to highlight relates to American exceptionalism. Many things are truly exceptional in America. In fact, Americans do take pride in American exceptionalism. Some exceptional things in the US are to be legitimately good, deserving to be the source of pride. However, many others are not. One is an exceptionally malignant form of racism, and the other one is excessive degree of economic disparity. During the pandemic, these social structural factors could be lethal. One key aspect of systemic racism is residential segregation. Here, segregated neighborhoods in Chicago are illustrated here. Just the areas are massively different in terms of proportion of Black people, African Americans. In big metropolitan areas, people end up living in different parts of the area, and Chicago is one of those most segregated cities in the United States. Areas occupied primarily by racial minorities, including Blacks and Hispanics, tend to be poor. These areas have less social and health-related resources. For example, the housing may be congested, medical services are less accessible, and healthy foods may be hard to get. Therefore, it is likely that metro areas that are racially segregated may be more vulnerable to COVID-19. In addition, some cities are not only segregated, but also economically unequal. Economic inequality can exacerbate the effect of residential segregation. Why? Because the poor, under-equipped areas may fare even worse. We recently carried out an analysis of the speed of the increase of COVID-related death in America's 100 largest metropolitan areas. All these areas are racially segregated, but some, such as Detroit and New York City, or Chicago for that matter, are more segregated than some other cities, such as Salt Lake City and Seattle. Also, some counties within each metropolitan area show greater income inequality than some other counties. Here's what we found when we used the measure of segregation between white and Black people. As you can see, the increase of death in the first 30 days of outbreaks is faster for more segregated and unequal areas. The same pattern emerged when the measure of segregation between whites and Hispanics are used. Interestingly, the same effect was invisible when the segregation between whites and Asians was used. This probably is due to the fact that even though Asian Americans suffer from racism, they still do better economically compared to Blacks and Hispanics. Other aspects in which Americans or America is exceptional is in its culture. American culture is very high in social openness. People are very open, easy to get along with. They choose their friends. They also find it very easy to have social relationships. Of course, they also find it just as easy to get rid of relations if they no longer like them. This cultural or social ecological trait is called relational mobility. I really like this aspects of American people very much. As Chris said, I'm from Japan. It makes it far easier for outsiders, like myself, to get into their culture and form meaningful social relationships. And I cannot appreciate this aspect of culture more. However, during the pandemic, this can be a liability. The virus spreads by social contact, and social openness lends itself to social contact with a wider range of people. In yet another recent study, we adopted countrywide scores of social openness or relational mobility. Again, relational mobility refers to the extent to which people in a given region think other people in general in that region, freely choose relationship partners and interact freely with others they like. From early work by Yuki, Thompson, and colleagues, countrywide scores are available. Using these scores, we showed that the spread of COVID-19 is faster in countries with high relational mobility. Here you can see that red signifies the data growth curve in the first 30 days of outbreaks in countries which are relatively high in relational mobility. Blue line indicate the mean slope for the countries which are relatively low in relational mobility. Here's a summary of regression coefficient. Y-axis is a regression coefficient, essentially the rate of increase of death in the first 30 days, and x-axis is a relational mobility. As you can see, as a function of relational mobility, spread of the virus become faster as a function of relational mobility. Whereas US is here. US is pretty high in relational mobility, and also US shows pretty high rate of spread of the COVID-related death. The effect reported here was quite sizable. For example, United States is among the highest countries in relational mobility. If it had been low in relational mobility, comparable, for example, with Japan, which happened to be one of the lowest countries in relational mobility, the death at the end of the 30-day study period in the US would have been only 8.2%, namely 281 of the actual number reported, which is 3,417. The series of studies reported I described so far has presented a compelling case, I hope, that America's suffering during the current pandemic has been exacerbated for multiple reasons, from historical to social, structural to cultural. However, this work is limited to the analysis of daily count of confirmed cases and death. While the focus on these public health statistics is fundamental, I think, because it informs societal level health consequences of social and cultural factors. However, it falls short of clarifying the psychological dynamics underlining the spread of the virus. This, I think, is a major omission. I'm a psychologist, after all. To illustrate why, consider many Americans who flock to the beaches of Southern California or Florida during the July 4th weekend. Or remember many bikers who blasted their Harley Davidsons to Sturgis, South Dakota in the second week of August. These behaviors may seem to be outliers, limited to those people who don't pay much attention to CDC or any other health agencies. However, the same applies to those people who gathered for the White House Rose Garden ceremony on September 26th to nominate a new Supreme Court justice. These incidents are wide-ranging, involving a wide variety of different types of people. However, there's one factor that cut across all the three examples. The apparent lack of care and respect for health guidelines happened in gatherings of like-minded individuals. Then the next question is this: why is it that people act as if there's no threat in a group of others who are similar and friendly? To address this question, I want to introduce three concepts. The first concept is social analgesia. We know that social relations are warm and comfortable, and is this merely a metaphor, or is there anything real to it? Well, recent studies have shown that close social relations can calm you down because they are warm. So you may not feel less pain when you are exposed to pain, or you may worry about, say, for example, some threat of infectious disease. You may feel less worry when you are you are in the company of very nice, friendly, close people. Here's one of the first study that made this point. In this study, researchers, Cron and colleagues, recruited happily married American couples. Wives are tested in an fMRI scanner. There are many trials. On each trial, they saw one of two cues. One cue told them that they might receive an electric shock with some probability at the end of the cueing period. This is a threat cue. The other cue told them that they would not receive any shock afterward on that trial. This is a safety cue. The focus was on brain reactions to these cues. One creative thing the researchers did in the study was this. The wives held the hand of their husband on some trials. On some other trials, they held the hand of a stranger they had not met before. On the remaining trials, they had no opportunity to hold anybody's hand. Then the researchers looked at the activation of the brain that is often recruited by a variety of threats, such as the threat of electric shock, and, well, in our case, most likely the threat of pathogen infections, including infection of COVID-19. One of the brain areas which is often implicated in response to fear, anxiety, some threat of electric shock or social exclusion, and so on, was anterior insular, here indicated in this brain map. So they focused on several areas, but anterior insular is one of them, and that shows the strongest, extremely clear-cut results. What they found was that anterior insular activity was stronger on the threat Q trials than on the safety Q trial. So replicating prior work, insular is recruited, so to speak, when there's a anxiety, there's a cue, there's an expectation of a threat, electric shock to come. Interestingly, however, this effect was less on the spouse hand condition than in either the stranger hand or the no hand condition. Just as interestingly, couples were all happily married, but some couples had much better relationship quality than some others based on existing psychological instrument called wife dyadic adjustment scale, and scores based on this scale. Here's the data, as you can see. Here, graphs are indicating that the effect of spouse hand was particularly pronounced for those wives whose scores were very high on this relational quality dimension. So what does this show? Well, this simply shows that social relationship of particularly nice people, with somebody you get along very well, can calm you down. Not only calm you down subjectively, but it seems to calm down some critical brain regions involved in, say, anxiety. Now, let me move on to the next concept, pluralistic ignorance. What is this? Pluralistic ignorance refers to a general phenomenon, actually, in which everybody feels that everybody else is endorsing a group norm in public, even though they don't support them in private. Now, what does this mean? Well, here's the idea. Idea is illustrated here. Here, somebody is discussing his proposal. Everybody is raising questions in private, and yet in public, everybody is showing agreement with the speaker. In this case, it is likely that everybody thinks everybody else is in agreement with the proposal, even though everybody is opposing to it in private. Now, let's consider this bar scene last summer in Sturgis, South Dakota, during the motorcycle festival. Everybody's happy and nobody's showing any anxiety or worry about COVID-19 infections. In all likelihood, however, many of them had already known that the disease was deadly. So we may imagine that everybody here is thinking everybody else is less worried than they are, even though they are all worried more or less similar extent in private. If so, here we are seeing a clear case of pluralistic ignorance. Social psychologists have proposed several mechanisms by which this curious effect occurs, but in the context of the pandemic, the effect may be related to social analgesia. That is, during the pandemic, everybody tends to worry about COVID-19 more or less similarly. However, when they interact with other people, particularly somebody very cozy, friendly, and supportive, these other people calm you down, calm down your anxiety, anterior insular, fear, because of social analgesia. What results then is that everybody ends up acting as if they have no worry because they don't feel the worry temporarily. Note, however, this is a case even though everybody does feel worried outside of the social interaction. As a result, everybody ends up thinking that they are more worried than the others, even though everybody is equally worried. This leads to my third concept, social comparison. When people perceive other people to be less worried about the pandemic than they are, there arises a motivational drive to show off their prowess and compensate for the threat to the self's perceived efficacy and strength. This drive to show the self to be more competent, more efficacious, stronger, or much bigger than itself in reality is very commonplace in some cultures, such as many segments in the United States. To illustrate, let's consider this simple task. You are given a sheet of paper. Just imagine that you have a sheet of paper. On it, you are to draw your social network. Use circles to show people in your social network, including yourself and a whole bunch of other guys who are included in your network. Then connect the circle to show your network. This is a straightforward task, but when you do this, there emerges a remarkable cultural difference. Across cultures, the size of circles for other people in the network don't vary much. However, when you look at the self circle, there's a massive variation. Some cultures, particularly individualistic cultures, show much bigger self than others. The United States is one of those cultures where the self is inflated quite a bit. This shows that Americans are motivated to show their worth, merit, competence, strength, and self-size. How about Asians, for example? Typically, they show no difference in size between the self-circles and circles for others. So far, I explained three concepts. Now I want to tie them together and link them back to COVID-19. When the pathogen threat is perceived as imminent, for example, people begin to die, people begin to be hospitalized, and people are getting really sick and so on, people experience fear and anxiety. That's a natural thing. This surely is very likely during COVID-19 pandemic because people do recognize the threat to be potentially lethal. Importantly, they know that they are afraid and worried. However, as I mentioned to you, the experience of such a threat may be temporarily blocked if people feel connected with close, supportive others. Such social relations have analgesic effects. While interacting with these people, people may not show any fear or anxiety because they don't feel them. Accordingly, most people will act as if they are not afraid or worried while interacting with other people, even though in private. When they are alone, not interacting with others, they are afraid and worried. This leads to a state called pluralistic ignorance, as I mentioned to you. Everybody feels that everybody else is less worried than themselves, even though everybody is just as worried as everybody else in private. At least in the United States culture, which emphasizes power, confidence, self-efficacy, and strength, this state of affairs is very problematic. This is very problematic for many people to think that they are more prone to anxiety and worry, and therefore weaker or less efficacious compared to many other people in your social circle. So these individuals may try to ensure that such weaknesses will not leak out and taint their public reputations. That is to say, that unfavorable social comparison induced by pluralistic ignorance is a potent motivator to compensate for their threatened reputation. And they do this compensation by exaggerating their personal strength and worth. This may lead to competitiveness as revealed in risk-taking behaviors, that is, non-obedience to public health guidelines, and maybe increased selfishness in social interaction. This analysis may shed light on the question of why America did so poorly during the pandemic. To show this, we must be reminded that some people are really weird. Let's put it this way. For example, look at this wonderful painting by a noted 16th century Dutch painter Bruegel. It shows a scene of a wedding, presumably wedding of a farmer, in the 16th century Europe, most likely somewhere in contemporary Netherlands. Some things are familiar to all of us. We'll still dance at weddings, in many cases, but some other things would seem very weird. Now, we never wear like this guy at the weddings, nor do we drink directly from the pot, at least in public. This concept of weirdness has been brought back to scientific literature recently when Joe Henrich, cultural anthropologist, and his colleagues used this term as an acronym for something. Weird in this context refers to Western educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. And we might ask ourselves, who are those weird people? Yes, many of us are weird. Americans are the prime example of weird people in the world. In the context of my discussion today, the most important point is that one primary feature of the weird people is their emphasis on the positivity of the personal self. We want to believe that I am good, meritorious, worthy, efficacious, and strong. One manifestation of this is the symbolic self-inflation effect I showed you a moment ago. However, another interesting feature of weird people is to actively affirm the merit, competence, and efficacy of close others. If you are teachers, you must support your students' self-esteem. If you are married, you must hug your spouse and say how great your spouse is or he or she looks every once in a while, at least, preferably daily. How do we do that? Well, we do this since you will not qualify as a friend or a spouse unless you are seriously supportive of your friend or spouse. Also, by affirming the other, you can also affirm yourself since your friend or spouse will reciprocate the support, compliment, and the praise. Also, the ability to be able to support is an index of your efficacy after all. This brings me back to the original question. Why have so many Americans been non-compliant and sometimes even reckless during the pandemic? My discussion today suggests that one important piece in addressing this puzzle lies in this model. This model is likely to be more applicable to weird people than the rest. So to sum up, I discussed 4 facets of social, cultural, and psychological dynamics involved in the coping with infectious diseases, including COVID-19. In all the 4 facets, Americans appear, say, handicapped in some significant ways relative to many other peoples, including Asians, but comparison groups can extend beyond Asians. This might explain why the United States and other countries culturally close to it, including many Western European countries, did so badly during the current pandemic, especially in comparison to most Asian countries. The 21st century is said to be the era of infectious disease. Due to industrialization, the physical distance between humans and wild animals is decreasing dramatically, so it may become increasingly frequent for infectious viruses of wild animal origin to spill over to humans. Furthermore, due to globalization, the viruses spilled over can travel worldwide so readily and so fast. We are currently witnessing the deadly consequences of this combination of industrialization and globalization. Now, the work I discussed today can broaden the psychological science by encompassing cultural, social, structural, and racial relations as crucial anchors in understanding human psychology. Moreover, as many evolutionarily oriented psychologists have argued that humans have co-evolved with infectious viruses. The most prominent of these scholars is Jared Diamond. Here's his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. He argued that virus is on par with guns and steel as an instrument in conquering other civilizations. From a different perspective, some other evolutionarily oriented psychologists have argued that culture's meanings and practices are serving the function of defending the civilizations against attacks from infectious viruses. So culture may be seen as an integral aspect of what may be called the behavioral immune system. Specific details must be added to this analysis by pursuing the type of work I discussed today. More broadly, since the infectious disease is a biological phenomenon at one level, and however, its spread is fully social, cultural, and psychological, and therefore its study must necessarily be fully interdisciplinary. Therefore, we might hope that by pursuing the current approach, there may be a realistic and viable way to integrate various sciences from genetics to neuroscience, neuroscience to psychology, and psychology to various social sciences and beyond. This was the vision of this prominent biologist, Edward Wilson, who argued for cross-disciplinary integration of scientific knowledge. Finally, it goes without saying that understanding infectious disease in all aspects, including people's reactions and coping with it, is highly practical. Therefore, it is quite apt to conclude this talk by quoting Kurt Lewin, one of the founders of social psychology, who observed, "Nothing is more practical than good theories." The dialectic between basic and applied research suggested here, going to enrich both science and society, I hope, And just as important, it is very essential to reaffirm the positive role of science in policies and decision-making at every level, from local to state to national and all the way up to international. I hope my discussion today is enough to persuade you that systematic psychological inquiry on the pandemic can shed some ray of light, even in the darkest moment in history. Thank you very much. The work I discussed here today is fully collaborative in my lab at the University of Michigan. Here, Martha Bark, Christina Salvador, Irene Marini, Chinkyung Yu, they are all wonderful, wonderful young scholars. And I want to acknowledge some funding and support from these institutions. Thank you very much. I look forward to addressing any questions. Thanks.
Great. No, that was really great. That was a lot of fun. I just have a few questions for you.
Sure.
So thinking about the social analgesia idea. So if I understood right, so there's this, we all obviously have this motivation for social contact, and I would think that would be particularly heightened, if I understood right, like in the context of fear, and which is a context we're all living in right now. So I wonder if you could just speak to age differences where this might be more prominent. So for example, my understanding what's going on a lot right now that's contributing to the spread of the virus is it's happening often among young people, and they spread it around, and those of us who are older may kind of judge them for that, but you seem to be indicating that there's a huge motivation for them to be seeking contact. I was just wondering if you could talk about that and how age differences might play into all this.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know of any data showing any age differences in need for affiliation. Well, you might remember this is a very old topic in social psychology. Schachter, very prominent social psychologist, studied this long time ago. But unfortunately, I don't know of any data about whether motivation for social affiliation could vary across age groups. So I don't know. However, it's very clear that in young adulthood, they are less secure. They are not in steady relationship. You know, I mean, some people are good, done, but some other people don't have any, you know, stable social relationships. And also, you know, say college age or high school age, that's a time of massive change, and they need lots of social support, peer support, and validation of the self, and so on. So it's very possible that this affiliation motive can manifest itself in very dramatic way in, say, college campus and so on. So I think that's a real possibility. Now, well, anyway, so that's my short answer, I guess.
Yeah, sorry, that's exactly what I was trying to get at. Not that there be, I think there may be evidence for it, but not that there necessarily is changes in affiliation. But, you know, people in a nuclear family with marriage don't need to go out and explore. But if you're living alone in a dorm and you can't go out, it makes it very tough on young people, right, particularly in this very stressful period. Everyone needs to have some kind of, be able to interact socially, and right, preventing that it can be very challenging. Yeah.
I agree.
Great. And so the other question I had is, I was wondering if you could just talk about how in the United States, culturally, of course, you know, we really value independence And along with that is a questioning of authority, questioning of expert opinion. I wonder how you view that all playing into this nice model that you've presented today.
Well, one issue I didn't say, in part because we haven't started investigating it, and also because of time limitation, is the fact, observation, that this non-compliance during the pandemic had attained symbolic meanings. That's a pretty much partisan issue, political issue. So if you examine, for example, big data coming from, say, cell phone use, it's very clear that non-compliance, that is, moving around in the city, is more common in so-called red state in comparison to blue state. Data seems very clear. Now, well, part of this, it could be just a questioning of authority, questioning of science, and all this may have been motivated by the previous president and whole administration. That's entirely possible. So non-compliance gained some added symbolic value. That's a good thing to do, to show you are a real man and so on, or a real woman for that matter, in support of the president, President Trump, that is, back then. However, I don't think that's the whole story. By no means I want to support or excuse the previous president. However, he himself had been elected by all those guys, people in the United States. And also, there was enough readiness to accept the type of message he was sharing. And that's part of the reason why he broadcast those kinds of messages so broadly and so intensely. He was a showman, and he know how to gain attraction and attention. So I think the problem can be deeper than that. And we need to explain why, some people are so much attracted to that kind of message at the time of pandemic. And that's part of the reason why we have been working on the psychological model. Those people are partisan. They are getting along very well. They often act in groups, so social analgesia may come in. But at the same time, they really value honor, kind of masculine honor of the country, honor of the self, honor of the citizen, no matter what consequences might be. They are very proud. Well, actually, Proud Boys, they call themselves, some of them call themselves. They are proud to be in some particular way. Very strong, very masculine, very, honorable. And I think those factors may conspire to have created this cultural climate that made Trump possible. So yeah, I think you're right. All those political backgrounds, political situations in the United States are very important. But the intent of my analysis I shared today was that I really wanted to sort things out to start explaining why this very interesting social phenomenon, interesting, psychologically from academic point of view, but horrible constellation of event happened to have produced this tragic, death toll in the United States.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And so the last question has to do with the future, which you were touching on. Yeah, so we can definitely count on this happening again. The last time there's a major pandemic like this, the most historically large one we know is 1918, but it's going to be happening more and more frequently, as you mentioned. Do you know of are there practical lessons you think that we can take from this in terms of messaging and other areas of social psychology that could help future leaders be able to keep control of this, at least in the United States, better?
Yeah. There are some, but before addressing those, I was very disappointed by Biden administration. It's only 2-3 days old now. But before it started, President Biden, President-elect Biden, appointed COVID-19 work group, task force. And well, you might be surprised to find no psychologist on it. I think that's a big disappointment as a psychologist, but also I think people need to know that spread of infectious viruses can be highly, highly psychological, cultural, and social psychological. So we need to know that something like social contact can make the virus more violent, and social contact is fully cultural, and I think it's very useful for Americans to kind of looking at American culture from distance to figure out how socially open they are, and reflect back on what's the problem about this, or they need to be aware of this fundamental role of social relationship in deflaying anxiety or fear. But good news here is that, well, it's kind of nice to hold your wife's hand directly. But over the last 10 years or so, my wife is in Japan and I'm here, and I'm not holding her hands or vice versa directly, but Skype or more recent month, Zoom can handle this pretty well. And actually, it's a matter of creating infrastructure. Digital infrastructure, maybe internet-based, which can address some of the social issues, social needs of individuals. So we don't have that right now. If you are living just by yourself in a dorm room, you are kind of isolated from the rest. And so university, for example, may address this issue by trying to find, say, Zoom, say, chat room or something, or creating some happy hour, delivering a piece of pizza to different dorm rooms and inviting them to come to discussion section on X and Y, which may be very fun to talk about. For example, this is off the top of my head. So that's very important. And also public education is very important part. Vaccination, that's well, I talked about BCG, and I think in this particular case, that's kind of a accident in history that really haunted Americans. However, there may be something deeper to it than this, because after all, vaccination is one of those social constraints the state imposed. And part of the reason why US didn't adopt this policy was an objection from many people. So again, we're kind of it's ironic that we are repeating the same story right now. And just a scientific sharing, dissemination of scientific knowledge on this, and transparency can bring us a long way to address this type of problem. And yeah, those are some of the items that occur to me right now. But above and beyond it, I think as a field, we need to make sure that policymakers become aware of psychological or social behavioral research on this topic and bring that knowledge to bear on policies and decision making.
Yeah, great. Great. Okay, well, thank you so much. That was excellent. Really, really.
Thank you so much. Thank you.